I'm Arthur Jafa. I'm an artist.
I'm Steve Locke, and I'm a painter.
My name is Mark Godfrey, and I'm a curator and art historian.
From David Zwirner, this is Dialogues, a podcast about artists and the way they think.
There's no struggling in these paintings in the sense of the way the forms are laid out. They're perfectly as mannered as any Manet or anything. Everything is perfectly in place. The structure that we are assigning to them, in a sense, is around these really complicated ideas.
So people say, like, you can't make a figure painting with the black figure being universal, and then Kerry James Marshall does it. And you can't make a painting about contemporary history, and then he does it. And you can't make a painting about Black life that doesn't talk about Black suffering or murder or violence, and then he does it.
I'm Helen Molesworth, your host for this season. Every episode features a conversation with artists, curators, writers, designers, philosophers, filmmakers, and musicians about what it means to make things today. Hey everybody, it's Helen, and we are back on the feed to talk about the one and only Kerry James Marshall. A major retrospective of his work, organized by Mark Godfrey, is currently on view at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, and the show contains a brand new cycle of paintings. As someone who has known Kerry for decades, I know that when he has something important to say, he says it with pictures. So in order to break it all down, I called my friends Steve Locke and Arthur Jafa, and our conversation went deep. But before we get into it, we got Mark Godfrey on the podcast to briefly set the scene for those of us who might not be able to see the show in person. For those of you who can make it to the Royal Academy, Kerry's show is on view through January 18th, and it travels onwards to the Kunsthaus in Zurich this spring, and its last stop will be the Musée d'Art Moderne in Paris next fall. Now here's Mark, followed by me and Arthur Jafa and Steve Locke. Happy listening. Mark, you've just organized Kerry James Marshall's most recent retrospective at the Royal Academy. And the RA's galleries are a far cry from the concrete floors and white walls of our typical contemporary art spaces. Can you tell us briefly how the RA's spaces influence the feel of the exhibition?
Sure, there are very grand spaces at the Royal Academy. There are very, very large galleries. There's one huge octagonal gallery, and then there are some slightly smaller galleries. Everything has the same ceiling height. If you look upwards, you'll see gilding in the ceilings. But you also have these incredible marble arches between some of the doors. Sometimes there's huge wooden frames between at the doorways. And in thinking about the grandeur of the architecture, I really thought about laying the show out in a particular way to make everything look amazing in those grand spaces. For instance, by having very long views towards particular paintings. And also I chose to get the walls painted particular colors that were borrowed from places like the National Gallery.
And Kerry has a new cycle of paintings depicting moments from the transatlantic slave trade. And how do these paintings appear in the show? Because it's my understanding this is their first viewing, so you're the first person to present them.
Yes, so there are 11 rooms in the show, and the show is organized into cycles or series of works. And so it has this emphasis on how he works in series. For instance, there are the 4 souvenir paintings. There's a series of the vignettes. There's a series from the early 90s of the first paintings he dealt with, the sort of impact of Middle Passage. The new paintings are shown in the 9th of 11 rooms. And I think it's very important that by the time people get to these paintings, they've seen portraits of abolitionists. They've thought about Kerry's prior way of thinking about the history of Africa as well.
And what color did you choose to paint the 9th gallery?
That is a maroon, and it's the same maroon as the first room. And the first room looks at Kerry's connection to the histories of the Academy. So it has a painting called The Academy. It also has the Metropolitan Museum's painting Untitled Studio and a few others. The octagonal room has the 4 souvenir paintings. So the new paintings are in a rectangular room. And there are two very long side walls. One has a triptych and one has three separate but equally large paintings. And then on the end walls, diagonal to one another, are the two paintings which are called the White Queens. One features Ruth Williams and the wife of Soretsa Karma, and one is Colette Hubert, the wife of Leopold Senghor.
All right, Mark, I really am so pleased that you were able to set the stage for us like that.
Thank you very much, Helen. Good to speak with you.
Good morning, gentlemen. Arthur Jafa, Steve Locke. I asked you both to come on the podcast today because Kerry James Marshall has a big exhibition up at the Royal Academy. It's a retrospective exhibition, but he has included in it 8 new paintings, and they are all thematically aligned. And it just struck me that it felt as momentous to me as like the Gerhard Richter Bader Meinhof group. Like it just felt like we should talk about these things, like because we know enough to know about Kerry at this point that the man does not do anything, 1, lightly, 2, by chance, 3, without considering it to be part of this master plan, this big overarching conceptual arc he has had for his practice for the last 30 to 40 years. He's been nothing if not deliberate. And so, AJ, I know you have been lucky enough to see the show in London a couple of times. Steve, you and I have been poring over the catalog.
Yes.
And I wanted to just sort of open it up. What did you think when you saw this suite of paintings?
I'm a big fan of Kerry's work, obviously. He's a person I feel like as much as any other, certainly as much, more than anybody else in the art world. He's a person I have the longest standing dialogue with about just the problematic and / opportunity that presents itself when you're a Black person entering into these spaces and stuff. And so I have a fairly I hesitate to call it rehearsed, but I have a pretty clearly formulated idea about how I understand his work, in general. I'm not quite sure I've had enough time with these to make much sense of them, honestly. I mean, there's a very peculiar detail in one of the paintings that I actually asked them about just because I was so curious about it. Yes, this piece, Outbound 2020. Yeah. And it just has one of the guys in the back of the boat has a guy who's tied up, suched up, almost like a package, and he's carrying him on his head.
Yeah.
And there's a kid on top of that guy's body, and then there's a seagull on top of the kid's head. And I just said, Kerry, what's that about? And he just said slavery. And I was like, yeah, well, right, And I was like, yeah, dude, I sort of get that. But, there was, it was at the opening. So I don't know if he was really, prepared to sort of delve into, the work in that context. So I just assumed that at some future date, he and I would be able to sit down and have a more, sort of thorough, Kerry, just to say something about the opening in particular, he seemed at the opening to me to be beatific. And it's not a mode that I typically associate with Kerry around his work. He seemed genuinely happy. The first time I ever heard of the Royal Academy was in the 80s, right around the first time I met Kerry. And Kerry articulated it as an ambition back in the 80s. I didn't know what the Royal Academy was, frankly. So this is as far back as I've known Kerry, which was right about the same time he graduated from the Otis Art Institute. He had just graduated when I met him. And this was the ambition of his, which I didn't even understand the full magnitude of it as an ambition at the time. So it was startling to be in the show. Obviously, the work is magnificent, but to actually see all the works laid out, in some ways, is unprecedented. Just for that, just to see a person's ambition spelled out in such concrete and specific terms over such a long arc, I think anybody who knows Kerry, I always say he has been for me the most focused and like again, I wouldn't say maniacal because there's nothing maniacal about Kerry, in his
Right.
in his demeanor or anything like that. But and deliberate somehow sounds not charged enough because it's not deliberate, like a person sitting there moving dominoes around, stuff like that.
There's some kind of compulsion that does not
Yeah,
appear to be
exactly.
pathological, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. It's driven,
Right.
incredibly
There's a
driven.
drive.
The most driven artists I know. Reminds me a lot of something A.B. Spellman said once about John Coltrane. He said, if you grew up in that generation of people like Monk and Charlie Parker and all these kinds of people, they just seemed like they just jumped out of somebody's head, like Olympian as gods. And he said, but the thing that was so unique about Coltrane, you could see him work himself into a genius.
Right.
And I'm careful about how I say it because I never want it to be taken the wrong way. But that's certainly one of the things I would say about Kerry. It reminds me very much of John Coltrane when you think of the obsessiveness of the approach and the thoroughness. They say train. He didn't just learn Western scales. He did mastered Indian scales, and he started looking at African scales. And this whole idea was to superimpose all these things so he could move however he wanted to move in the sonic arena. And Kerry, to me, always struck me as a person that wanted to master all the aspects of the things that he had set for himself, and then very, very intentionally decide which ones he wanted to play inside of and which ones he was going to disregard. Number one, he disregarded, and this is where he and I feel like have always been perfectly aligned. He wanted to disregard this idea that I think sort of existed, certainly when we were growing up, which is that somehow you had to make your work less Black in order for it to be universal. Like it's an utter refusal of that. You know what I mean? That your thing can be as Black as you want it to be, and it can still be universal. That's not a split that we accept. And so you see in his work that pushed to the absolute limits of that idea, And as far as other things, like I'm saying, a lot of formal things, you can see Kerry, he has perfect understanding of classic Renaissance perspective and all of this old master kind of stuff. But clearly, he feels a lot more aligned with some of the power, I would say the power. Like, again, he's the person who introduced me to some of Bowie and Giotto and people like that. He's very, very interested in the pre-Renaissance painters, but the sort of primordial European painters and stuff. And so there's this really complex maneuvering through all the various stages of Western pictorial space. Like he's doing all this, like you say, there's a conceptual dimension to this thing that's undeniable. But part of his project, if you want to call it, part of his project is how to sit in the conceptual space so perfectly that it just seems like you did a new thing, but it doesn't necessarily, like you don't look at these things, they don't feel like conceptual exercises to me. It's much more grounded and manifest than even maybe he achieves a certain kind of eminence in the work. You know what I mean? They don't seem like they're trying. That's what I'm trying to get at. They don't really seem like they're trying. They seem almost as if they are the products of an alternate universe where some of these splits and disjunctions and discrepancies between Western art practice and non-Western art practice aren't at least aren't so over-determining,
Steve, you looked at the book. What'd you think?
I first of all, I could listen to AJ talk all day, but there's such a compelling argument to be made for, I don't know Kerry James Marshall. I met him once. Your partner, Susan Deckerman, had a print show at Harvard, and I wrote an essay about the work, and I met him very, very briefly. And he had a tremendously regal presence, and I felt like really, really honored to be able to engage with his work in that way. And I followed it, as a painter my whole career. Kerry James Marshall gave us freedom to not have to do certain things. We didn't have to prove our Blackness. We didn't have to we didn't have to center white people's understanding of Blackness as the crux of our project. We could just paint, we could just work and like not have to worry about that stuff. It wasn't our problem. And like I'm in the long legacy of that. Me, Mario Moore, Tylon Sawyer. There's all these Black artists who are working figuratively who stopped thinking about anything else and just worked on figuration. You know, even though we were told it was retardé or it wasn't contemporary, and that the bankruptcy of painting, he just completely destroyed that argument. You know, it's very hard to make a painting. People think it's easy. People think it's some sort of like, that's what the paint by numbers paintings sort of posit. It's the way people think about what a painter does, especially a painter who's painting things that are discernible in the world, replicating the world, right? What Kerry James Marshall does is very hard, and to do it in acrylic paint, which is not a very forgiving medium, unlike oil, which is made to be manipulated. And almost all the paintings that he looks at as his lodestars are oil paintings. You know, so he's using a different material on a different surface, and still with the expressed goal to make something that is at the scale of the real, at the impact of the real, but not real, right? And those kinds of things, that is a tall order for a painter. Richter couldn't even do it. Richter's practice collapses over and over again, and that's what we find interesting about Richter is the failure, but the discovery within the failure. Kerry James Marshall doesn't fail, and that's the thing. He makes you believe it, and you can't deny what you see because the mastery is there and the image is there. It's like someone saying to Gainsborough, you can't make a painting where blue is the dominant color in the composition. And then Gainsborough paints the blue boy. Yeah. So people say like, you can't make a figure painting with the black figure being universal. And then Kerry James Marshall does it. And you can't make a painting about contemporary history, and then he does it. And you can't make a painting about Black life that doesn't talk about Black suffering or murder or violence, and then he does it. And he keeps doing it over and over again, not to prove anything to anyone, but to say like these things, the complexity of Blackness in the paintings, the color Black, is married to the complexity of understanding this subject of Black life. And Black people can do everything from like, you know, fall in love in the Rococo, they can be in boats, they can play with their children, they can do all the things that white people have done in art throughout the centuries. Like they can do all the same things. And the picture doesn't have to be remedial or somehow less skilled because it's in the hands of a Black artist. And so seeing those last paintings, that last cycle of paintings that really deal with something that Black Americans are dealing with now, like the idea that somehow, let's deal with how we got here. Like, let's deal with it. Can we finally just deal with it? I'm 62, right? I grew up in segregation. I met the first African immigrant to this country. I must have been in my late 20s, early 30s. Right? The notion that a Black person would immigrate to this country is completely insane to me. It's completely crazy. And I don't mean to be negative about immigrants at all. I really don't. Like, knowing what I know about this country, I can't imagine that any Black person would want to immigrate here. I just can't imagine it. And so there's a conversation that's happening now about Black Americans as a distinct people and African immigrants as part of the immigration that keeps this country vital, right? And I think that these paintings land right in the middle of that conversation. And it's not, like I say, it's not a new conversation. In Darby English's essay, he quotes Zora Neale Hurston and her discovery about that. And, you know, when I was in school, like there's all this sort of hotep nonsense about Black people are the sun people and white people are the ice people, and like all this sort of crazy stuff that people like Henry Louis Gates were like, no, let's get to the bottom of it. Let's get to the bottom of it. Slavery wasn't this like thing that just sort of jumped up out of the earth and just happened all of a sudden. There were people involved. There were collaborators. There were all these sorts of stuff. And so to pretend otherwise is a luxury that Black people in America have never had. And the big project to talk about history is also to talk about complicity, talk about who did what to who and how it happened.
And maybe
Because
I'll just interject for a second
Go ahead.
because our listeners, I don't want to lose folks. The suite of paintings to a letter deal with the participation of African people in the transatlantic slave trade, the participation of African people in abducting and ferrying
and benefiting
and hog tying and all of it. What Hortense Spillers once called in a film that AJ made, called Dreams Are Colder Than Death, the Black people in America had an intramural problem that they had to talk about, that they weren't prepared to talk about. And one of the things that I find so arresting about these paintings is partly because I've had Spillers in my head for years now, haven't known what to do with it. And I feel like Kerry took up the challenge. Yep. Kerry took up the challenge of saying, I'm going to make a suite of, and here's one thing I would love it if we could talk a little bit about. These paintings are ravishing. They are so beautiful. They're some of Kerry's most beautiful paintings.
This is what painting can do. He can make it so beautiful and so compelling that you stop and you look and it makes you think about Black complicity in the slave trade. It makes you think about it. If he didn't make it as beautiful and as compelling as possible, it would be agitprop. It would be a joke, right?
There's always that great Benjamin quote, right? That there is no culture without barbarism.
Right. See, two things to me kind of come to mind. I just want to go back to something that you said earlier, Steve. You were talking about this whole question of Black African people immigrating to the U.S. See, what I would add inside of that, which I kind of agree with what you were getting at, is something like, well, I'm not sure they are Black when they come here. I think they're African people integrating to the U.S. And when they come here, the process of all the various structures, white supremacist structures and stuff, then they become Black. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like the first time I went to Africa, and I was in my maybe mid-30s. The thing that was really striking about it was like how many presumptions I had. I didn't even know I had some of these presumptions. So they started flying out the window. You know what I mean? I was only conscious of them as they were being disabused. They were things that are just sort of there. And one of the conclusions I came to after that was that I don't think I met many Black people when I was in Africa. You know, I mean, obviously I know it's a socio-political category. Yeah, of course they're Black socio-politically, but in terms ontologically, I just don't think, like that first experience forced me to think through, what did we mean? What did I mean? What did I understand by Blackness? And I think one of the sort of constituting ideas to me of having arrived at Blackness as an identity and as an ontological fact is something like the absence of so many things, like the absence of continuous histories, unbroken histories and stuff like that. And nobody that I don't know if I've ever met anybody in Africa who had that at all. I mean, there are all kinds of maladies there, you know, post-colonial and colonial maladies and stuff like this, but everybody seemed to pretty much know who they were. And that is such a fundamental difference. So even like I said, I'm being a little quiet because, like I said, I hadn't really sort of started to try to unpack these particular paintings in a way. So I'm listening to some of the things you guys are saying and like what I agree with, what I'm not sure about. But one of the things I would say is the problematic, because it's funny, until you said it, Helen, I wouldn't have necessarily thought I didn't sit in front of these paintings and think, oh, these are paintings about the complicity of Black people in the slave trade. I mean, like you said, rightfully, the person who most powerfully presented the idea to me, I kind of asked Hortense. That part is not in the film, but I asked her because something I was very interested in because of my travels in Africa. And I remember I said, how do we end up here? Something like that. She said, well, I can answer two ways. She said, poetically is one way I can answer. She said, but in fact, she said, and that's something like we fell away from the way. But she said, in fact, and that's when she went into the whole thing, that essentially it was an intramural problem that had gotten folded into something else that was really not at the core of it, and that problem had to do with, as you guys were both saying, is like the complicity of Africans in the African slave trade. And I would go just a touch further and even say, and it is in many ways largely if not Oedipal problem, it is certainly a psychoanalytical problem, because as you said, people who grew up under segregation or on the edges of segregation and stuff. Now, I can remember like in Ebony magazine, a site for a whole bunch of stuff like Kerry's practice wouldn't exist without Ebony magazine, because I'm sure just like everybody else, that was the beginning of him seeing a collective Black shaping of our own rendering of ourselves on the covers of Ebony and Jet, right? It's the first place I ever saw a Charles White painting. Kerry shit wouldn't exist without Charles White. You know what I mean? Like that. So the beginnings of what it means to render the Black experience for us to begin, like, and I don't mean like, of course, in the Harlem Renaissance, stuff like that. From the beginning, Black people always attempted to render themselves, but I'm saying in some collective mass way that sort of only media can do, as a rallying point. I mean, I agree when Cornell said the only institution Black people had was the church. And so you can see how much of our culture, that's the next, is the church. Well, Ebony Johnson Publications and stuff was another kind of institution. It's a virtual institution because it's not an actual place. But everybody, when I grew up, there was no such thing as a Black household that didn't have Jet and Ebony magazine. Now, I'm making a leap there, but wouldn't you agree with that, Steve?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Yeah. So it seems to me that part of what, why I'm resistant to say certain things, like, I tend to say, this is what it is because I've thought about it and I feel very strongly about it. I'm being a little hesitant, but I think part of why I'm being hesitant is because it's very complicated what he's trying to render. Like I said, I didn't necessarily look at these and think that. I knew it was slavery, but I didn't think, oh, this is a Hortense proposition played out. Because the question becomes, if it's about a very complicated split between what it means to be Black versus what it means to be African, because I think all Black people are African, of African descent, but I'm not sure all Africans are Black. Something like that. How do you make that delineation? Like in a picture where, like, who do we identify with as the sort of products of the slave trade? Do we identify with the people, like, just to take, that painting for a split second we were talking about? Do we take the people who are rowing the boat? Or do we take the person who's tied up? How do we distinguish the person who's, that's why I think my eye went right to this of all the paintings. The one thing that's carried, what is it about? Because first of all, it's not naturalistic at all. It's like the one thing, one of the few things that leaps out you as being very not naturalistic is that this guy is carrying a person on his head. Now, anybody who's been to Africa, even if you've seen photos, the first thing you see that's startling, because you don't see any equivalent of this, is people carrying goods on their heads, women in particular. So in this small gesture, that's one way he has explicitly said, this is a Black person as a commodity. And as a subject, but as an object. That's a Black person that's been turned into an object. I think that's why my mind went to it, like, whoa, okay. And then I have I have to try to decode this thing, what it means to have a boy sitting on top of the Black person who's commodified, and then a seagull on his head. I think you're getting at something when you say there's a sort of a totemic dimension of it, And so a totem is a kind of linear array of forms, let's say. But then there's something about African art. Kerry gave me an article in the 80s. He gave it to me, a piece called Power and Accumulation in African Art. So I know it's something Kerry was thinking about and we've talked about, which is something like, what does it mean to gather things so that they create a new aggregate effect? But in the case of African art, it's not linear like a totem, like they're organized on the line. It's like you build a constellation of effects, and the aggregate affect of it is something very specific. And that's what I think he's starting to do in this. And inside of a thing that's undeniably a painting, because these kind of effects of accumulation and things like that are things I associate more. It's more like a sculptural effect, honestly. You're taking physical objects and manipulate them like that, because it doesn't collapse into cubism, which is another place where you see this accumulation of things, but it's not cubistic at all. So,
Right.
yeah.
You know, that question of identification and who the viewer is identifying with. I mean, I just want to go back to one thing you said, AJ, at the beginning about that the Black figure is universal. Like that I think is undeniable in Kerry. Like, I think that space is very opened up. And of course, in the suite of paintings, there are a few moments where people look directly out of the canvas at the viewer. And that is a big moment in the history of Western painting, like when that shift happens and there is direct address. And it happens, I think, really powerfully in Hall at the very left-hand side. One of the figures who is rowing the boat, and there's a kind of intensity with which that figure leans into the oar. Like,
oh, yeah.
Like you can really feel like, oh, you know, rowing a boat with all that stuff, all that loot, all those things on it would be hard. And that figure is, you know, that figure looks out at you. Like he is not looking in the direction of where he is going. He is looking at you, the viewer. And it's funny, AJ, that you asked Kerry about this sort of totemic figure. I literally texted him last night and was like, is that a self-portrait? Like, because there's something about the eyes that's very Kerry to me. And it also looks a bit like a self-portrait he made for the New York Times Magazine, you know, back in like 2018 or 19. And Kerry being Kerry, he wrote me back a very sweet text that said, any resemblance to anyone I knew was purely coincidental.
Oh, yeah, right. Sure. Okay. Tell me anything.
I mean, you know, it's like, I would say two things about that figure. It is startling to turn and actually look at it. First of all, because of the nature of Kerry's investigation of the Black figure, it's buried in a certain kind of way. To me, it doesn't leap out. It doesn't stand out. It doesn't stand out as it's like somebody put a spotlight on it. Once you see it, you see, oh, it's breaking the picture plane. But it's not something that as you see it from a distance, your eyes are going to go there. And the other thing I would say, there's so much direct address in Kerry's paintings. It's almost a feature of his paintings that figures so often are looking. You know, my favorite Kerry painting, you know, I've told you this of all time, is Scout. I love Scout. And those eyes are just they drill into you. You know what I mean? So I guess I didn't respond to it, you know, necessarily like that. Like I said, it's really interesting looking at it now, because I think it's very much embedded in the overall pictorial space, you know.
I think about it a little bit differently because, you know, Outbound is taking people out to be trafficked, right?
Right.
And Hall is bringing back all the stuff that they got in exchange for the people, right? And it also talks about the hierarchy within that community, because those guys rowing the boat are not the guys who are going to benefit from all the stuff in that boat.
Right.
So like there's a and because like the woman is wearing jewels and cowrie shells, and the other guy has a gun and he's wearing like quote unquote Western clothing, whatever that means in this context. And the rowers are rowing because that they are they're the workers. They're not going to benefit. They might get like something, but they're certainly not going to benefit from the massive amount of wealth that is on that boat.
Right.
And I think that figure looking at us is letting us know that. And so we don't get to judge all these people. Like, I think that it's like I said before, you can make a painting and it could be very, very easy. It could be Manichaean. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. This is who you root for. This is who you root against. And I think that in this cycle of paintings, it's really, really, really complicated. And it's complicated in a way that complicates the argument and the discussion, the intramural discussion that AJ was talking about among Black people. I think that it's hard to have a relationship with a place that sold you, right? How do we deal with the the Oedipal dimension of that, which is a framing that I would like to embrace, right? And then how do we deal with the fact that like it's a known secret, and like we're not supposed to have this conversation in front of white people. Like that is the thing, that is the trepidation that a lot of people have, and because if we give white people this kind of ammunition, then they can blame us for our own enslavement. And I think that the paintings posit that we're mature enough and brave enough to have this conversation because it's something that's known. It's known. So why are we pretending it's not happening?
But see, the thing to me, like, again, about this whole issue, first of all, what does it mean to know? Number one, what does it mean to know? Like going back to Ebony magazine and stuff, like one of the things I remember in the Kings and Queens of Africa, the calendars, those are some of the first visualizations of Black people beyond slavery that I remember, just seeing a lot of those that I wouldn't say everybody had it, but everybody saw the Kings and Queens of Africa calendar series, a poster series, right? And the thing is like when you hear Africa, like one of the things, like just see the Oedipal, or like I say sometimes, I'm not sure if it's strictly speaking Oedipal, but let's say psychoanalytical dimension of it has something to do with what you say. You say it's a given, but I'm not sure it is on any conscious level. The idea, like even like when you think of something like Black rage, okay, meaning this sort of unspecific anger that Black people have towards, like say, whiteness and white people in general, which is understandable, let's say. But I've always felt like, and I've said this before, I've always felt like what's buried inside of white rage is something like a kind of rage that it's not really named that often, meaning something like, who are you going to be most angry at? The person who bought you or the person who sold you? If the person who sold you is ostensibly family. See, I don't think we've really begun to unpack that. And I do think the paintings, to me, the question is, are the paintings jest, and it's not a small jest, are they aligned with this, what I think is the beginnings of a more unpacked, complicated reading of the tension versus the identification or solidarity between Blacks and Africans, let's say? Or is it actually, what is it actually saying about that? That's why I say I got to really go back and do more of a deep dive and trying to understand the nature of Kerry's rhetorical strategies in the paintings.
Historically, it's been pressure on Black artists to not tell tales out of school, like to keep things in-house and things like that, which I think after the post-Black show, where people started to feel like it was outmoded to talk about race in that way, that we're past all that now, right? I don't think we are. I don't think we ever were. I also think that, there's a big discussion that needs to be had that isn't being had. And I don't think it's the artist's role to like tell you what to think. But I think that this cycle of paintings, like, what does it mean that like Black heroes are married to white women? Like, what does that mean? Let's think about that. Like you make this pronouncement of a Black identity and Black solidarity and all this sort of stuff, which is great. And like, I'm not against any of that stuff, but it's sort of like, feminism is the doctrine and lesbianism is the practice. You know what I mean? Like, it's this sort of idea like, oh, if you're going to believe that, then you're going to do this. And people aren't like that. People have relationships with who they have relationships with. It's not predetermined. Like, it's not some sort of racial agenda that you have to fulfill in your romantic life. So, I mean, I think the paintings ask us to hold complexity in a way by imaging something that we struggle with. So the paint, like going back to someone like Jacob Lawrence, where the paintings don't just depict a struggle, they are struggle themselves. They embody it, right? And I think that kind of thing is what's happening in these later paintings.
The question I would want to ask Kerry, and it's less a question to ask him but to say, I'm really interested. Like if you put, like, say, for example, you said Jacob Lawrence. That's great. What you just said, I agree with that. But the question becomes, how do these paintings function and what his intentions were? Like what strategically? Not that it's the artist's job to explain away their paintings and stuff, but because we all know Kerry is so intentional, I'd be really curious to know how he thought about the distinction, if he would agree with this, there's a distinction between how Jacob Lawrence takes on struggle and how he's taking on struggle, which is, in a way, there's no struggling in these paintings in the sense of the way the forms are laid out. They're perfectly as mannered as any manet or anything. Everything is perfectly in place. So there's no struggle like that. The structure that we are assigning to them, in a sense, is around these really complicated ideas that are complicated to say, much less picture or render. So I would be very curious to hear Kerry talk about, that's why I say his rhetorical strategies, how he understood, like you mentioned earlier, like Richter's bottom line, how it got mentioned early, like you kind of get what his rhetorical strategy is. I would almost go so far as to say something like, these may be some of the most experimental paintings that Kerry has ever made, because I find his rhetorical maneuvers in his work, in the larger body of his work, always seem incredibly lucid to me. Here, I'm not saying they're not lucid. I'm saying they don't fold themselves out in such a way that you can't mistake them. Like I feel like in his other paintings, there's something about, I'm doing this. It's almost like, it's funny. It's a joke. I'm thinking. Somebody said, "Oh yeah," in the church. Somebody said this once before. This guy Jimmy Hops, he gave this thing. He called it the showing method. He gave me a piece of paper, like back in the 80s. He says, it's like they do in the church. He said, you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. Like I find Kerry's paintings to be profound demonstrations of that genius showing strategy. And here, I'm not so sure if I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you what I told you. They seem to be in some other space.
It's very interesting to me to hear you say that, because one of the things I thought in looking at them, and it's sort of what I meant in the beginning, like I feel like he's moved from being a painter of everyday life to being a history painter, and that is a very different set of rhetorical strategies.
Different. That's what I'm saying. I don't even know where to start.
It's a completely different operation.
Painting is always engaged in sort of imaging things that are historic that we weren't there to witness, right?
100%.
So no one knows what the Annunciation looked like. No one was there for that. But there's so many paintings imagining what it looked like. So let's imagine what it's like to wait for a coffle of slaves to arrive, to be transported. Like who's there? Like that is the part of Hartman that I think is so important, because these things happen. Like there are these people who are at home and then they're enslaved. And like, how did that happen? We don't have any record. We don't have any images of it. So we have to invent. Right. And, we have discernment. We can figure out who did what. And then how do you make an image of it that is as compelling as the rape of the Fabian women, or the death of Socrates, or something like that? And I think that that's the place where where Kerry's, the determination of his project is. Like it's not enough to have the idea. It's just not enough. And I think that a lot of art suffers from poor execution of good ideas right now. Like it's a great idea, but like no one wants to look at that picture. No one wants to come see that performance. Nobody wants to do that. But you walk into the Louvre and you see the coronation of Josephine. They're like, yeah, I'm not particularly French, and I'm not particularly interested in the coronation of Josephine, but it's a compelling image. And I think that these paintings sit in that area, that they become compelling because of the mastery with which they're painted. And I also, I shudder to disagree with AJ, but I think that he is, I I do think that he is very clear about what he's talking about. He's talking about the implications of Blackness. And like, let's really talk about who did what to who. Let's really talk about it. How did we get here? How did we get here? And not just we Black people, but we as a society, how did we get here? Maybe it wasn't some sort of huge international conspiracy to destroy Black culture. Maybe it was just simple greed. Maybe it was just simple greed and people like trying to make the best of the situation. And but the truth of the matter is that if we don't start to have that conversation, we can have that conversation through art by making images that are compelling to make us think about that. They don't solve that problem.
I'm not even sure we disagree. What I was trying to get at is something like, what are the limits of a painting to say things? It's a very complicated problem.
Oh yeah, that's a different question.
It's similar to like, what are the limits of cinema to say things? Like sometimes people will ask me, like journalists have asked me in the school, what were you trying to say? And my immediate response is like, well, I'm very good at saying what I want to say, but my videos or sculptures or pictures are not trying to say anything. Right. Saying is not the only way that you can make declarations about the world, or you could assert things about the world. Saying is a very, language is a very specific way of creating articulations about the world. Pictures don't necessarily do what language do. That's why oftentimes when you start seeing these analyses of paintings, first thing people start doing is talking about them. They start trying to make a painting into a paragraph. Writing about art is hard because at the end of the day, the pictorial thing resists being reduced to language. Right. And that they said the most sophisticated, what we would call art theory, is really literary theory. A lot of the first people who wrote about art were literary people who were writing about art. And so they imposed a kind of frame on the pictures, which sometimes it's elucidating and insightful, but sometimes it's trying to do things like narrativized paintings in a way that's a little forced. You know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So Kerry is, if nothing else, this is another way of saying, he is tactical. He is the most tactical artist I have ever met. He's an investigator. He's an explorer of the space that he set out to explore. He's always exploring, finding things, collating those things, organizing them into his system of, his arsenal of things that he can do. But he is also extremely tactical.
Right.
The intentionality of it, the ambition of it. It seemed to me always like, not that he didn't make adjustments, but he always had a map. He had a plan, a battle plan, which that's what I was saying. You go to that show, you see, wow, it's like Napoleonic maneuvers or something. You just see this tactical thing that this person set out to do and achieve. And that's an accomplishment for anybody, but for a Black man of our generation, it's incredible to see it laid out in the way that it's laid out, like magnificent and startling and awe-inspiring, really. I was like, wow, I know you, dude. I'm still flabbergasted. It's also like to look at some of these paintings and remember conversations I with Kerry. I was like, Kerry, how the fuck did you paint that, man? Like, he was like, oh, I rolled up part of it. You know what I mean? For years, Kerry was painting parts of the painting, letting that shit dry, rolling it up and rolling out because the studio couldn't fit the scale that he was starting to work at.
Right.
And the impacts on how you make the thing. So I'm going through the show it was a little bit like the flashback. Part of Kerry's genius and superpower, and it's a superpower we should all have, he is self-authorizing. He doesn't need anybody's authorization to do anything he does. And one of the things that I think it's a very classical Black value, like as opposed to African, specifically Black people in the Americas, or Black people in the U.S. in this case, I would even say. And what Kerry, one of the markers of his genius is his ability to use Black pictorial strategies, rhetorical strategies that aren't a product of the history of Western painting. They come from outside of it. Like, for example, you could write an essay about Black fans in churches. The imagery of Martin Luther King and people like this on fans and the impact that that has had. You can see that coursing through all of Kerry's paintings. These fans that everybody has seen are funeral posters, funeral home posters with images. These are Black pictorial modalities that don't normally even get talked about as a legitimate, but everybody's known them. Right. You could see them in Ebony magazine. You could see them in any Black church. There's a history of funeral homes making calendars at the beginning of the year. And the type of images that they put on those calendars or on those fans, or, you know what I mean? And this is like, in spite of, you know, something I've mentioned before in the past too, Cornell's pretty brilliant observation that one of the reasons that Black pictorial culture is, he said it was not very apparent initially. Some other people said it's marginal. They said things, but basically what he said is because the Black church is largely a Protestant church. So visuality enters into it in a very weird way. It's not the music, the dance, the oratorical stuff was always embraced fully, but the Black visual thing, not. It's always had to find its own way. But in the fans, in the hymnals, and the things, that's where you see it pop up. It's like very furtively almost snuck in. Kerry is aware of all of those things, and he has utilized them and repurposed them, you know, in his works very, very powerfully.
Yeah.
You guys, I love both of you.
I could talk to you all day.
I love Kerry James Marshall. Thank you both so much.
Okay,
Thanks, Helen.
Okay.
AJ, it's great to talk to you, man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dialogues is produced by David Zwirner. If you like this episode, please follow, rate, and review us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. It really does help the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. I hope you join us here next time.